What is up, everybody? This is JP. Today's video is going to be about isolation movements and whether or not you should include them in your workout program. Now, for those of you who don't know, an isolation movement is just a movement that's isolating one muscle group and one joint. For example, in a bicep curl, it's not really only one muscle working. You know, let's not get too nitpicky with the definition. It's mainly the biceps that are working in a bicep curl. But again, we could talk about the brachioradialis or the brachialis working in that exercise too. So the main way to tell if it's an isolation exercise is if it's one main joint that's moving during the exercise. So again, like a bicep curl would be the elbow. Now, for those of you who are building a program or you're following your program, you may have come across the question, and I've been asked this before, is should I do isolation exercises? So first, I'm going to talk about where are some scenarios where you should include isolation exercise on top of your compound movement. So the first scenario, which is pretty kind of obvious for a lot of people, is people who are advanced athletes, advanced bodybuilders who are past the beginner stage of progression. They passed even intermediates actually too. So I would say intermediates and advanced athletes who are lifting probably have room to include isolation movements at the end of their workout for whatever they're trying to do and however you like to set it up. The reason being is that when you hit a certain level of progression, like from a beginner to advanced, there's more of a requirement on your end for the amount of volume that you have to do to maintain gains and even increase gains. A beginner does not need to do a lot of volume for a muscle group to see gains. They actually don't need to do that much at all. Where an advanced lifter is going to have to do more volume to keep up that muscle, and they're going to have to keep doing more and more volume over time, over the long run, compared to when they were a beginner, to keep seeing growth in that muscle. Another scenario where isolation movements are good to include into a workout program is for lagging body parts. So let's just say you're someone who feels like you're getting trap work. Your traps are getting worked during deadlifts, and let's just say they're getting hit in multiple different areas because they get hit whenever you pick up a weight. But let's just say you feel like they're lagging compared to other muscle groups, or when you look at your physique, you're like, you know what, I feel like this is the sore thumb sticking out of my physique. My traps are just very underdeveloped. In that case, you can do some isolation work on the traps to help kind of pick it up compared to the other body parts on you, and so it's not so lagging, whether that's for a competition or just for your own personal growth in lifting. There's one caveat with that one though, is you have to make sure that the reason that it's not a lagging body part is that you're not doing too much volume. Because sometimes when you look at muscle group crossover, some people may say, oh, this muscle doesn't look like it's developing well, and I'm going to start doing more and more volume and more exercises on it. And you might actually be hitting it too much, because some studies have shown that when you're just doing way too much volume on a muscle, it stops, it ceases to grow, and there's actually a point where you start to regress in muscle growth. You can actually start to go backwards. So you got to be real careful. Look at all the exercises you're doing and see if there's any muscle group crossover between exercises. So if you have underdeveloped traps, or your traps aren't growing the way that you want, and you're already doing deadlifts, you're already doing a bunch of armored carries, you're doing all types of different holds, you already have one day where you have dedicated shrugs, and you're like, you know what, I'm gonna throw in more shrugs and different variations of shrugs, but you count it and you're already doing shrugs 3 times a week. You might be doing too much. You might just need more recovery, or you might actually have to back off the trap work a little bit. So just be careful when you're trying to fix lagging body parts and look at the whole picture. The last reason I think it would be good to include isolation movements into your program is if it's a muscle group that is not going to get hit that much if you don't do an isolation exercise for it. Let me give you an example. So for the lateral portion of the delt, if you're not doing a lateral raise, anything that does abduction at the shoulder, you are not going to be getting a lot of direct work on the lateral delt. It's just not going to happen. Now, if you're doing some variation of overhead press where your arm is horizontally abducted away from you and you're pressing like that, that will get the lateral delt to some extent, but again, it might not get it to the exact extent that you want with direct work. Obviously, some people have talked about doing upright rows and how those target the lateral delts, and those do. Another example like the lateral delts is calves. yes, the calves do get hit with flexion of the knee. So if you're doing hamstring curls, the calves are going to get hit. Calves do get hit during certain exercises like squats a little bit, but is that enough of attention and overall enough of a stimulus to get the calves to grow the way that you want them to? Probably not. So the calves are another scenario where you might want to do some isolation work. Now, times that I don't think that you should include isolation movements in your program, or you should maybe contemplate how much you're doing that. The first one is pretty obvious. It's for beginners. If you're someone just starting out, you probably don't need to do isolation movements. Now, there's one caveat to this, is in the previous tips that I just gave you, if you're a beginner and you want to work on your calves, that's a scenario where you might want to do an isolation exercise for your calves, is because your calves aren't going to be getting hit any other way unless you're doing some form of calf raise. But for a beginner, if you're doing pull downs, some back exercises where you have a supinated grip specifically, some pull down with the supinated grip, rows with the supinated grip, and you're doing a lot of different variations of back work. So throwing bicep exercises at the end of your workout when you already hit biceps a lot during your back exercises might just be overkill, and I might not be doing anything extra. You might not be getting any more of a hypertrophic response from doing that. Same thing goes with the triceps. Same thing goes for a lot of different exercises. Like, for example, the front delt, always getting hit. Virtually every single pressing movement, whether it's a horizontal pressing movement, a vertical pressing movement. For a beginner, if you're already doing pressing movements, then I personally don't think that adding any more, exercises where you're already hitting those muscle groups in those compound lifts is going to do you any benefit. The second scenario where I feel like it's just, you might want to be careful with where you throw in isolation movements. It's kind of similar to the first one. Even if you are an advanced athlete, I don't believe that you should do isolations for every single muscle group. The front delt being an example. An advanced athlete is going to be doing various amounts of presses, horizontal presses with a lot of horizontal adduction of the humerus. So any movement at the shoulder, just like this, bringing your arm across your body, the pecs and the front delt are going to be highly activated in this type of movement. And this movement is pretty much what everyone does in the gym. A bench press is this movement, a dumbbell press is this movement, a push-up is this movement. I mean, there are so many movements that hit the front delt that I just don't think dedicating direct isolation work to those specific muscle groups is just not necessary. And again, this varies dependent on the person and the program. So front delt is just one example that even for advanced athletes, it's borderline pointless, and it's just overkill at that point. Now, overall, I think you have to take this a case-by-case basis. So I just think you need to take where you're at and your training age, if you're a beginner or if you're an advanced, where your lagging body parts are, and you need to be careful of muscle crossover. If you look at those parameters and kind of take each one case by case, you can say, okay, well, I'm already hitting this muscle group a ton, I don't need to be hitting it anymore. Oh, well, I just realized that I'm not really hitting this muscle group at all in any of the exercises, and it's also a lagging body part, I'm gonna throw that in. Or you also have to factor in adherence too. Some people, like for example powerlifters, don't necessarily have to do calves. It might just be more work that's kind of pointless, and even if they have small calves, they might not care, so that's always a factor. If you guys have any questions, comments, leave them down below. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.